I still remember the exact moment my life was sold. There was no shouting, no chaos, no dramatic warning, just silence, and a signature. My mother sat across from me, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes never met mine. She whispered, "I'm sorry," but even in that moment I knew she didn't mean it. Because if she did, she wouldn't have let it happen. I was 19 years old, and the man they were handing me over to was almost 40. His name was Alexander Blackwood. That was the day I stopped being someone's daughter and became something else entirely. Not a person, not family, a deal. You would think I cried. You would think I begged them to stop. But I didn't. Because the truth is, something inside me had already been breaking for years. That day didn't destroy me. It just finished the job. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. Everything about it screamed wealth and success. But inside it was cold, empty, loveless. My father never really saw me as his daughter. To him, I was just a responsibility he didn't want. My stepmother didn't even try to hide her hatred. Every word from her felt like a reminder that I didn't belong. I remember once hearing her say that I was useless. That word stayed with me longer than anything else. Useless. And eventually, they found a way to give me a use. Money had become a problem, and I had become the solution. When my father told me to stand up that day, I felt nothing. Not fear. Not anger. Just emptiness. I stood there while Alexander looked at me like he was assessing something he was about to buy. His gaze wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was calculating, careful, controlled. He asked if I understood the terms. My father answered for me, laughing like it was all some kind of joke. He said I didn't need to understand, that I would learn. That's when I finally spoke. I asked a simple question. Why me? For the first time in a long time, my father actually looked at me. And then he smiled. He said it was because I was the easiest to get rid of. I didn't cry when he said that. But something inside me went completely silent. Not broken, just gone. The man I had once hoped would protect me had just erased me with a single sentence. A few moments later, Alexander stood up. His presence filled the room without him needing to say much. There was something about him that made everything feel controlled. For a brief second, I thought I saw something in his eyes. Not sympathy, not cruelty, something else. Interest. He told me to get in the car. He didn't explain anything. He didn't try to comfort me. And somehow, that made it easier to move. Because there were no lies. Just reality. I walked out of that house without looking back. Not at my father. Not at my stepmother. Not even at my mother. Because deep down, I already knew. There was nothing left for me there. The car ride was silent. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on your chest. I kept waiting for him to say something. To explain what was going to happen to me. But he didn't. Not for a long time. And then, without even looking at me, he asked a question I wasn't expecting. He asked if I hated them. I didn't answer right away. Because for years, I had tried not to hate them. I had tried to convince myself that maybe one day things would change. But in that moment, I realized the truth. So I said yes. I told him I hated them. There was a pause after that. A quiet moment where everything seemed to settle. And then he said something that changed everything. He said good. That was the first time I looked at him properly. There was a faint smile on his face. Not warm. Not comforting. But certain. Confident. Like he already knew something I didn't. He finally turned his head and looked directly at me. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't realized before. This man wasn't just powerful. He was dangerous. But not in the way I had feared. In a completely different way. Because the next thing he said didn't sound like a threat to me. It sounded like a promise. He told me that by the time he was done, they would regret everything. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what he was planning. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt something. Not fear. Not sadness. Something unfamiliar. Something stronger. Hope. And I had no idea that the man they had chosen to destroy me was about to become the reason I would rise. The drive felt longer than it probably was. Not because of distance, but because of everything I had just left behind. Or maybe, everything that had left me. I didn't ask where we were going. I didn't ask what would happen next. Some part of me already understood that my life was no longer mine to question. And yet, there was something strangely calm about the silence between us. It wasn't suffocating. It wasn't cruel. It was controlled. Deliberate. Like everything about him. When the car finally stopped, I didn't move right away. I looked outside the window and realized we weren't in the city anymore. We were somewhere quieter. Private. The kind of place where the world doesn't reach unless it's invited. The gates alone told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just wealth. This was power. The kind of power that doesn't need to prove itself. The kind of power that people fear. As the gates slowly opened, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear. Not anymore. Something sharper. Awareness. The car moved forward, and I caught a glimpse of the house. No, not a house. A mansion. Massive. Silent. Untouchable. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a place where secrets lived. And somehow, I was now part of them. When the car stopped, he stepped out first. Calm as always. Unbothered. Like this was just another ordinary moment in his life. For him, maybe it was. For me, it was everything. I followed him without being told to. Not because I had to, but because I didn't see another choice. Inside, everything was quiet. Too quiet. No noise. No chaos. No tension like the house I grew up in. Just stillness. And for the first time in years, I realized how loud my old life had been. Pain has a sound. And I had been living inside it for too long. A woman approached us, elegant and composed. She looked at me briefly, not with judgment, but with curiosity. He didn't introduce me the way I expected. He didn't explain who I was. He simply said, "She stays." That was it. No labels. No explanations. But somehow it meant more. Because it didn't sound temporary. It sounded final. I was taken to a room that was bigger than anything I had ever had before. Clean. Warm. Perfect. Too perfect. I stood there for a long time, not touching anything, because it didn't feel like mine. It felt like I didn't belong in it, just like I had never belonged anywhere. But then a strange thought crossed my mind. What if I wasn't brought here to be small? What if this was something else? That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was scared, but because my mind wouldn't stop trying to understand him. Alexander Blackwood wasn't what I expected. He hadn't touched me. Hadn't threatened me, hadn't even tried to control me in the way I had prepared myself for. Instead, he had done something worse. He had given me space, and I didn't know what to do with it. The next morning, everything changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt intentional. I was given clothes. Not cheap ones. Not basic ones. Elegant. Expensive. Chosen carefully. Like someone had already decided who I was supposed to become. And that's when I realized something that made my chest tighten. This wasn't about breaking me. This was about rebuilding me. But the question was, why? Later that day, I saw him again. He was standing near the window, looking out like he owned everything beyond it. Maybe he did. I hesitated before speaking. But this time, I didn't stay silent. I asked him the question that had been burning inside me since the moment I met him. Why did you bring me here? He didn't answer immediately. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable as always. The days that followed didn't feel real. Not because they were perfect, but because they were controlled in a way I had never experienced before. Everything around me moved with quiet precision. Nothing was random. Nothing was careless. And slowly, I began to understand that neither was he. Alexander Blackwood didn't act without reason. Every word, every silence, meant something. And somehow, without even realizing it, I had become part of that pattern. At first, I thought I was just staying there. Existing. Waiting for something to happen. But that wasn't what he had planned. Because little by little things started changing. Not around me. Within me. It started with small things. The way people spoke to me. With respect. Not fake kindness. Not forced politeness. Real respect. It confused me more than anything else. Because I hadn't done anything to earn it. At least that's what I thought. Then came the lessons. They weren't called lessons. No one ever said, "You need to learn this." But every day, I was exposed to something new. How to carry myself. How to speak without hesitation. How to look someone in the eye and not feel small. How to stay silent and still be in control. It wasn't forced. No one yelled at me. No one pressured me. But the expectation was always there. Unspoken, but undeniable. And the strangest part was, I wanted to meet it. I wanted to change. Not for them. Not even for him. But for myself. Because for the first time, I could see a version of me that wasn't broken. A version that wasn't useless. Days turned into weeks. And somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like a guest. I stopped feeling like something temporary. But I still didn't understand him. Not completely. Until one night, everything shifted again. I had gone downstairs, unable to sleep, the silence of the house feeling heavier than usual. That's when I heard voices. Low, controlled, serious. Not emotional, but dangerous. I wasn't trying to listen, but something in their tone made it impossible to walk away. His voice was different, colder, sharper, like the calm surface I had seen until now was only a small part of who he really was. He was talking about business, but it didn't sound like normal business. It sounded like power, influence, control over things far beyond money. And then, I heard something that made my breath stop. A name. My father's name. I didn't move. I couldn't. Because in that moment, everything I thought I understood started to fall apart. He wasn't just some powerful man who happened to take me in. This was intentional. All of it. Me. My family. The deal. It wasn't random. It was planned. Carefully. Precisely. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if I had been saved or chosen. That night, I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions. Because I knew something had changed. Not outside. Inside me. The next time I saw him, I looked at him differently. Not as someone to fear. Not as someone to depend on. But as someone I needed to understand. Completely. Because my life was now connected to his in ways I didn't fully see yet. And I couldn't afford to be blind. When I finally spoke to him again, my voice didn't shake. I asked him directly, "Did you know my family before this?" He didn't deny it. He didn't look surprised. He simply watched me, like he had been waiting for that question. And then he said yes. Just like that. No excuses. No hesitation. That honesty hit harder than any lie ever could. I asked him why. Why me? Why this? He told me that I wasn't taken because I was weak. I was chosen. Because I was the only one they underestimated. The only one they thought didn't matter. And in his world, that made me the most dangerous of all. I didn't know how to react to that. Because for so long, I had believed them. Believed that I was nothing. But now, someone was telling me the opposite. And not just someone. Him. A man who clearly didn't waste time or effort on things that didn't matter. So if he chose me, there had to be a reason. And for the first time, I started to wonder if my past wasn't just something to escape, but something that was about to become my greatest weapon. That night, I didn't feel confused anymore. I didn't feel lost. I felt aware. And awareness is dangerous. Because once you see the truth, you can't go back to being blind. And I knew, whatever this was, whatever he was preparing me for, it wasn't going to be small. It wasn't going to be simple. And it definitely wasn't going to be safe. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what was coming. I was ready for it. Because now, I finally understood one thing. I wasn't just part of his world anymore. I was becoming part of his plan. And whatever that plan was, it was going to destroy everything that once tried to destroy me. After that night, something inside me changed in a way I couldn't ignore. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't loud. But it was permanent. For the first time in my life, I stopped seeing myself through their eyes. I stopped hearing their voices in my head. Useless. Replaceable. Nothing. Those words didn't disappear completely, but they lost their power. Because now, there was something stronger replacing them. Awareness. Purpose. And something even more dangerous. Control. I started paying attention to everything. The way people spoke in his world. The way decisions were made without hesitation. The way power didn't need to be announced. It simply existed. And slowly, I adapted. Not because anyone forced me to, but because I chose to. Every day, I became a little more like the person I used to imagine in silence. Confident, calm, unbreakable. And the strangest part was, no one seemed surprised. As if this version of me had always been there, waiting. Alexander noticed it too. Of course he did. He noticed everything. But he didn't praise me. He didn't encourage me with words. Instead, he did something far more meaningful. He started including me. Not fully. Not completely. But enough to make one thing clear. I was no longer just someone staying under his roof. I was becoming someone who stood beside him. And that terrified me more than anything else. Because standing beside someone like him meant one thing. There was no going back. Days later, he gave me my first real choice. Not an order. Not a command. A choice. He told me that there was going to be a meeting. Important. Sensitive. And connected to my family. He didn't explain everything. He didn't need to. Because by now, I already understood enough. This was it. The beginning. My heart should have been racing. I should have been nervous. But I wasn't. I was calm. Too calm. And that's when I realized. I wasn't the same person they had sold. That version of me wouldn't have survived this moment. But this version? This version was ready. I didn't ask what my role would be. I didn't ask what he expected from me. I simply said yes. And for the first time, I saw something shift in his expression. Not surprise. Not approval. Something quieter. Something deeper. Respect. The day of the meeting came faster than I expected. Everything about it felt deliberate. Controlled. Calculated. Just like him. But this time, I was part of that control. When I stepped into that world, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel out of place. I felt aware. Present. Watching everything. Just like he had taught me without ever saying the words. And then, I saw them. My past. Standing right in front of me. My father. My stepmother. People who once looked at me like I was nothing. People who believed I would never be more than a problem they could get rid of. And for a brief second, time slowed. Not because I was weak, but because I was remembering. Remembering who I used to be. So I could fully understand who I had become. They didn't recognize me at first. Not really. They saw me, but they didn't see me. Because the person they thought they knew didn't exist anymore. And when it finally hit them, when they realized who was standing in front of them, the change in their expressions was something I will never forget. Shock, confusion, and underneath it all, fear. That was the moment everything shifted. Not in the room, inside them. Because for the first time, they weren't in control. I didn't speak right away. I didn't need to. Silence, when used correctly, is louder than anything else. And I had learned that well. When I finally did speak, my voice didn't shake. It didn't break. It didn't carry pain. It carried something else. Finality. I didn't accuse them. I didn't remind them of what they had done. Because I didn't need to. They already knew. Instead, I looked at them the same way they once looked at me. Without emotion. Without attachment. Without hesitation. And in that moment, I understood something that changed everything. Revenge isn't loud. It isn't messy. It isn't emotional. Real revenge is control. And for the first time, I had it. The meeting didn't end the way they expected. Because this time, they weren't making the decisions. They weren't setting the terms. They weren't holding the power. We were. And I was part of that we. As everything unfolded, I didn't feel satisfaction the way I thought I would. I didn't feel anger either. I felt something much colder. Closure. Not complete. Not yet. But enough to know. This was only the beginning. When it was over, I didn't look back at them. Not once. Because they no longer deserved my attention. And as I walked away, I realized something that made everything clear. They thought they had sold me to destroy me. But in reality, They had handed me over to the one person who would teach me how to rise above them. And now, they were going to watch me become everything they never believed I could be. Not slowly, not quietly, but inevitably. And the most dangerous part of all was that I was no longer doing this for survival. I was doing it because I had chosen to. And once something becomes a choice, it becomes unstoppable. After that meeting, everything changed in a way that couldn't be undone. Not just for them, but for me. I had spent most of my life believing that power belonged to people like my father. People who controlled others through fear, money, and manipulation. But now I understood something far more important. Power doesn't belong to those who abuse it. It belongs to those who understand it. And I was beginning to understand it very well. The days that followed were different. Not quieter, not calmer, but sharper, more focused. Because now, I wasn't just observing his world. I was moving within it. Decisions were no longer things I watched from a distance. They were things I was part of. At first it was subtle, small opinions, minor choices. But every time I spoke, he listened. Not as someone humoring me, but as someone evaluating me. And the more I proved myself, the more space I was given. Until one day, it stopped feeling like I was being tested, and started feeling like I was being trusted. That realization was heavier than anything else. Because trust, in a world like his, was more valuable than anything money could buy, and far more dangerous to lose. But the most unexpected change wasn't the power. It wasn't the control. It was him. Alexander Blackwood wasn't a man who showed emotion easily. Everything about him was measured, controlled, unreadable. But there were moments, small ones, where that control slipped. Not in weakness, but in something else. Something real. I started noticing the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Not with possession, not with expectation, but with something quieter. Recognition. As if he was seeing the person I was becoming, before I fully saw it myself. And that unsettled me more than anything else. Because for the first time, I wasn't just changing. I was being seen. And that's a dangerous thing. Because once someone sees you clearly, they can either destroy you, or become impossible to walk away from. I didn't know which one he would be. Maybe both. But I stopped trying to figure it out. Because I had something else to focus on. Them. My past wasn't finished yet. And neither was I. The first real shift came when I learned the truth about what my family had been hiding. It wasn't just debt. It wasn't just bad decisions. It was betrayal. They had crossed people they should have never touched, made deals they couldn't control. And when everything started falling apart, they didn't fix it. They ran from it. And in the process, they used me as a shield, as a distraction, as something disposable. That truth didn't break me. It didn't even shock me. Because deep down, I had always known they were capable of it. But knowing it, and seeing it clearly, are two very different things. And now, there was no illusion left. Which meant there was no hesitation either. The next move wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. Calculated. I didn't go after them directly. That would have been too easy. Too emotional. Instead, I went after what they depended on. Their stability. Their reputation. Their control. Little by little, things started slipping from their hands. Opportunities disappeared. Allies turned distant. Support they once relied on started fading. And the most powerful part of it all? They didn't know it was me. Not at first. To them, it felt like bad luck. Like consequences finally catching up. But I knew the truth. And so did he. He never stopped me. Never questioned me. He simply watched. Allowed it. Guided it, without ever making it obvious. And that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just my revenge anymore. This was alignment. Two people moving toward the same outcome, without needing to say it out loud. And somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like I was chasing revenge. I started feeling like I was claiming something. My place. My voice. My power. The moment it all became real was unexpected. Not because of what happened, but because of how I felt. I heard about their situation. How everything was starting to collapse. How they were losing control. And for a brief moment, I waited for the anger, the satisfaction, the sense of victory. But none of it came. Instead, I felt calm, because this was never about hurting them. It was about becoming someone they could never hurt again. And I had already done that. Everything else was just the result. That was the moment I realized something important. I wasn't the same girl anymore. Not even close. That version of me had been left behind the moment I walked out of that house. What stood here now was someone else entirely. Someone stronger, sharper, untouchable. And as I stood there, looking at everything I had become, I understood the truth they would never be able to accept. They didn't destroy me. They created me. And now, I wasn't just surviving. I was rising. Not quietly. Not temporarily. But completely. And the most dangerous part of all was that I was only just getting started. Because what they didn't know yet was that losing everything was only the beginning of what they were about to face. And when the truth finally reached them, when they finally understood who I had become, it wouldn't just break them. It would end them. By the time everything began to fall apart for them, I was no longer watching from a distance. I was standing at the center of it. Not as a victim. Not as someone seeking revenge. But as someone who had already won. Long before the end arrived, their world didn't collapse all at once. It happened slowly, piece by piece, the way real consequences always do. The people they once trusted started disappearing from their side. The influence they once relied on stopped working. The control they believed they had over everything slipped through their fingers like it had never truly belonged to them. And the most terrifying part for them? They couldn't stop it. Because they couldn't see it. Not yet. But that didn't last long. The truth always finds its way to the surface. And when it did, it didn't come quietly. It came with clarity. With realization. With fear. I still remember the moment they finally understood. The moment everything connected. The moment they saw me, not as the girl they once threw away, but as the reason everything around them was falling apart. That was the moment they broke. Not financially. Not socially. But internally. Because nothing destroys a person faster than realizing they created their own downfall. They tried to reach out. Of course they did. Desperation makes people do things they once thought were beneath them. Calls. Messages. Excuses. Apologies that came far too late to mean anything. But I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish them. But because I no longer needed anything from them. Not closure. Not validation. Not even revenge. Because I had already taken back everything they once made me believe I didn't deserve. My worth. My voice. My power. And once you have those things, there's nothing left for the past to take from you. The final meeting wasn't planned the way people would expect. There were no dramatic confrontations. No raised voices. No emotional outbursts. Because I wasn't that person anymore. And they no longer had the power to make me become her again. When I saw them for the last time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pain. I felt distance. Like I was looking at something that no longer belonged to me. Something I had outgrown. They looked smaller. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. The same people who once controlled my entire world now stood in front of me, uncertain, unstable, and afraid. And for a moment, I simply let them sit in that reality. Because sometimes, silence is the loudest truth of all. When I finally spoke, my words were simple, clear, final. I didn't remind them of what they had done. I didn't list their mistakes. I didn't need to. They were already living the consequences. Instead, I told them something they would never forget. I told them that they had been right about one thing. I had been easy to get rid of. But what they didn't understand was that some things don't disappear when you throw them away. They transform. They evolve. They come back stronger than you ever imagined. Then realizing they created their own downfall, they tried to reach out. Of course they did. Desperation makes people do things they once thought were beneath them. Calls. Messages. Excuses. Apologies that came far too late to mean anything. But I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I no longer needed anything from them. Not closure, not validation, not even revenge, because I had already taken back everything they once made me believe I didn't deserve. My worth, my voice, my power. And once you have those things, there's nothing left for the past to take from you. The final meeting wasn't planned the way people would expect. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, no emotional outbursts, because I wasn't that person anymore. And they no longer had the power to make me become her again. When I saw them for the last time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pain. I felt distance. Like I was looking at something that no longer belonged to me. Something I had outgrown. They looked smaller. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. The same people who once controlled my entire world now stood in front of me, uncertain, unstable, and afraid. And for a moment, I simply let them sit in that reality, because sometimes, silence is the loudest truth of all. When I finally spoke, my words were simple, clear, final. I didn't remind them of what they had done. I didn't list their mistakes. I didn't need to. They were already living the consequences. Instead, I told them something they would never forget. I told them that they had been right about one thing. I had been easy to get rid of. But what they didn't understand was that some things don't disappear when you throw them away. They transform. They evolve. They come back stronger than you ever imagined. I was no longer surviving. I was no longer becoming. I had already arrived. And the truth they would have to live with for the rest of their lives was that the girl they tried to erase didn't just come back stronger. She came back as something unstoppable. Not a victim. Not a mistake. Not a memory. But a queen. And this time, no one was taking that away from me.